NASA has launched its biggest mission in years, and 4 astronauts are now on their way to the moon. Meanwhile, another spacecraft is getting ready to head for Mars's moons, and Chinese rockets fly their maiden flights. As always, we've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. Wow, it's finally happening! 4 astronauts are actually on their way to the moon! Now, they won't go in for a landing just yet, but they will be closer than anyone has been since Apollo 17 in 1972. So, what's happened and what can we expect to see in the next few days? Well, stay right here because we're going to cover all of it. Earlier this week, the countdown clock started ticking for the Artemis II mission, kicking off an intense 49-hour and 40-minute process to prepare the SLS rocket and its astronauts for liftoff. It all went swimmingly. There were a few minor issues like communication hiccups with the flight termination system and some faulty temperature readings on one of the launch abort system batteries, but those were quickly resolved. All in all, this was probably the smoothest countdown of any SLS wet dress rehearsal and launch attempt thus far. Then on April 1st at 23:35 UTC, the countdown reached 0 and SLS lifted off from the pad at Launch Complex 39B for the second Artemis mission and the first with humans on board. NASA astronauts Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Canadian Space Agency's Jeremy Hansen were on board Orion and ready to put the capsule and the rocket through its paces. Only about 10 minutes into the launch window, and the very first window for this mission I might add, SLS took to the Floridian skies for a textbook launch. The solid rocket boosters burned out and separated cleanly, after which the core stage proceeded to push Orion almost into orbit. The capsule deployed its solar panels, and then, 49 minutes after liftoff, the ICPS upper stage ignited its RL-10 engine for the perigee raise maneuver, putting the capsule into orbit. NASA briefly lost audio communications with the capsule after a handover between TDRS communications satellites, but that was also quickly resolved. Nearly an hour later, the stage lit its engine again to raise the orbit's apogee, or highest point, to over 70,000 kilometers, much further than any astronaut has been in over half a century. Next, the capsule separated from the ICPS, which meant that it was time for the astronauts to get to work. Reid Wiseman and Victor Glover took control of the spacecraft to manually fly it around, demonstrating its ability to approach another spacecraft, such as one of the future landers. This time, though, there wasn't any lander, so they flew around the ICPS upper stage instead. Then it was time to say goodbye to the ICPS, which left its capsule and its passengers to themselves. But before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, the ICPS deployed 4 CubeSats for NASA's international partners. Argentina's Atenea satellite will study radiation shielding and test long-range communications, while Germany's Tacheles will test and demonstrate some technologies for future lunar vehicles. Unsurprisingly, the Saudi Space Agency's Space Weather CubeSat 1 will study space weather, and South Korea's K-RAD-Cube will measure the biological effects of radiation throughout the Van Allen radiation belts. Meanwhile, the crew on board Orion was diagnosing an issue with the spacecraft's toilet. Now, to be fair, it in itself is actually a milestone. This is now the farthest that any toilet has traveled from Earth, so, it's kind of understandable that maybe some issues might have popped up.
I'll take that one. I'm the space plumber. I'm proud to call myself the space plumber. I like to say that it is probably the most important piece of equipment on board. So we were all breathing a sigh of relief when it turned out to be just fine. It was just an issue, I think, of sitting for a long time and needing a little time to warm up, a priming issue.
But eventually it was resolved, and the crew went to sleep for a 4-hour nap, after which the capsule ignited its service module engine for 43 seconds to insert itself into a stable high Earth orbit, from where it prepared to head for the moon. With the go for translunar injection given, Orion lit the main engine on its European service module for 5 minutes and 50 seconds at 23:49 Universal Time on April 2nd. The burn changed the craft's velocity by nearly 390 meters per second in the right direction for it to leave Earth orbit behind and head for our celestial companion. Now, that's just the Cliffs Notes. If you want the full rundown of what's happened so far, Ryan covered it in detail over on our Breaking Space channel. So yeah, the 4 astronauts are actually now on their way to the moon. It was a long time in the making, but it's all starting to feel very, very real now. Before the launch, NSF's own Max Evans sat down with NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman, who explained the gravity of this moment.
These crew are undertaking, the most dangerous human spaceflight mission in, 53 years. it is a whole nother animal once we commit to TLI. Like, we've not been in that business for more than a half century, and the we can come home in hours thing no longer is applicable. So yeah, when we commit to that, I mean, everything is going to be about getting them undershoot safely in the water again. And look, I hope we get through as many of the mission objectives as we possibly can, grow confidence in Orion and SLS, because we do have to get right back at this and start stacking for Artemis III.
But why go through all of this if we're not even landing on the moon yet? Why did NASA launch Artemis II in the first place? Well, it's the first step towards an actual landing, and a landing is yet another step towards even bigger plans. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That landing is still some years away, and in the meantime, NASA wants to ensure that it's ready and has the skills and experience to actually pull it off. Artemis II is just one step in that plan. Recently, Jared announced changes to the Artemis program to increase launch cadence in an attempt to build up more experience within the teams.
I felt like we owed it to the public to not only give them the path forward for Artemis II, but actually an achievable path forward for getting back to the moon. And I shared that with a lot of the Exploration Ground Systems team. This is when I was here over a weekend, I don't know, probably a couple months ago, basically when we found the helium flow issue. And I was talking to them about it, and it was like, how many of you guys are planning to stick around after Artemis II? And like a very large percentage were like, I'm here for the mission, like I've worked for a long time to get to this point, but yeah, I'm gonna go do other things. And who can blame them? Like, why would you want to wait around another 3 years? So right there, I mean, you're hearing it right from the people themselves that they do not want to wait 3 years for the next opportunity. So you're literally hearing the people tell you that the muscle memory is walking out the door. And then you're going to have to rebuild it again. And again, you're going to wind up relearning exactly the same lessons we learned with Artemis II if we didn't get into a good cadence.
Now, ultimately, this accelerated cadence should not only help to retain experience and build us up to astronauts landing on the moon again, but to building a moon base. We're going back to the moon, and this time to stay. NASA announced the plans recently during its ignition event.
You know what I would say, though? What we tried to lay out is achievable plans. Everything we do at NASA is pretty ambitious, right? I mean, it should be. We're NASA on that. But we could have put this wild 3D rendering of the glass dome on the moon with, plants in it and, a Ferris wheel and kids having fun or something, and be like, okay, that looks pretty wild. It never would happen, right? Like, we're actually trying to do pretty challenging things, but in a logical, iterative way, a phased approach to getting to the outcomes that we want to see. That's why, like phase one, I've described to people, hey, the moon might look like a junkyard. There could be a lot of broke down rovers and landers somewhere.
Jared and Max went into much more detail on what's to come, so you should really watch the whole interview on our channel. They even dove into how nuclear reactors could support a moon base and future missions to Mars and beyond. Before we can think about all of these long-term plans, though, NASA's got to wrap up the Artemis II mission first. So, what's to come in the next few days? Well, with the translunar injection burn complete, Artemis II and its crew are now on their way out to the moon. That trip will take a little under 4 days, and while you might think, well, that's a lot of empty time for the crew, they're actually going to be quite busy. For starters, every day they'll have regular downlink events where they'll speak to the ground as part of the mission's outreach, which is no small task. The crew will also be refreshing and discussing the plans for the lunar observation that they'll be performing during the lunar flyby. The outbound trip will also include more manual piloting tests of Orion's propulsion systems, and this very same propulsion system will be tasked to perform regular trajectory correction burns to keep the spacecraft in the correct path to the moon. Additionally, there will be another test of the crew's suits the day prior to the lunar flyby. Now, these are some of the specific tasks that the crew will be performing during the outbound cruise, but there's still the whole living and working inside of Orion part of the test flight, which, after all, is what Artemis II is all about. Everything that the crew does inside of the capsule is, at the end of the day, part of the spacecraft's testing. And yes, that also includes using the toilet. This will also include the regular use of the flywheel exercise device that they've already tested prior to the translunar injection burn, which is very much needed to keep them in shape during the whole mission. Once the crew approaches the moon, they'll prepare for the lunar observation period, in which they'll photograph surface features with the many different cameras on board. To prepare for that, the crew trained on the ground with expert photographers, as well as with fellow NASA astronaut Don Pettit, who took every opportunity that he had while in space to flex his photography skills.
First and foremost, I guess you and I share a great passion behind the camera. I'm a photographer as well, but my subjects are mostly here on the ground, whereas yours have always been pointed down. How would you approach photographing the moon, especially from the far side, like the Artemis II crew will?
Well, first you have to figure out what your field of views are going to be. You've got rather smallish windows. You're going to be like 6,500 kilometers away, and the windows are made out of cast acrylic, so the optical properties aren't the best. So you can't just screw on a long telephoto lens and get really sharp imagery. You're going to have to choose the appropriate telephoto lens and then get whatever that happens to show up in your pictures. And I'm thinking there would be, obvious picture to try to recreate is Earthrise.
Yeah, of course.
During this flyby, the crew will have a unique view of the far side of the moon. This is because during the Apollo missions, they had to go to the moon when the landing site, located on the near side, was illuminated, which meant that most of the far side of the moon was in nighttime. Truly the dark side of the moon. But in the case of Artemis II, there will be parts of the far side of the moon that will be illuminated during the time of the flyby.
As Jeremy said, when we see Oriental, human eyes have never seen that. Never seen that. We've seen it in satellite photos, but humans have never, ever seen that before. That's cool.
After the lunar flyby, the crew will continue to be busy reporting feedback on Orion systems as they live on board for the approximately 4-day return trip. There will be more downlink events after the flyby, but the most important one will come the day after that flyby occurs, which will see the crew of Integrity talk directly to the crew of the International Space Station instead of talking to the ground. This will be a very unique first for this mission, because back when Apollo missions were going to the moon, there was no continued presence in low Earth orbit. The inbound cruise will also include more testing of the manual control capabilities of Orion and a demonstration to set up and configure a makeshift radiation shielding bunker for the crew inside of Orion. Now, this is important because unlike missions in low Earth orbit, missions to the moon don't get the advantage of being inside of the Earth's magnetic field. So if the sun decides to shoot a solar storm towards Earth, setting up radiation shielding can actually help the crew to stay safe inside of Orion while the worst of the storm is ongoing. While there will be a few correction burns during the outbound and inbound cruise, the translunar injection burn is also the deorbit burn for Integrity and its crew, since it also sets them up for the lunar flyby and return to Earth. That return to Earth should occur about 9 days after launch, with splashdown expected to happen on April 11th at 6 minutes past midnight UTC. While that will be the end of the Artemis II mission, it definitely doesn't mean that NASA will be sitting around doing nothing. April will also see the arrival of Artemis III hardware to the Kennedy Space Center, which will include the majority of the core stage for the SLS rocket that will be used in that mission.
You know, and you're like 3.5 weeks away from rolling out the next core stage.
Yeah.
And people start telling people it's time to start believing again. Like, hardware's going to start showing up at KSC again. We're going to start stacking again. We're going to make a point that this can be done a lot faster than people think possible.
Well, Jared, we can't wait to see that hardware arrive, and we'll have our Space Coast live cameras ready to see it all in action. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with an upcoming rocket. Stoke Space has begun fitting its Zenith engines onto the first stage of its reusable Nova rocket. This marks a visible step forward as the vehicle literally starts to come together. The engines have undergone a series of hot fire tests recently, including aggressive gimbaling to stress the thrust vector control system. By driving the engines through increasingly rapid movements, Stoke is validating how quickly and precisely Nova will be able to respond to commands and steer itself during flight. Nova will be powered by a cluster of 7 Zenith engines, and installing the first one into the aft section of the first stage is a clear sign that the rocket is moving from isolated testing to integrated assembly. Elsewhere, in late March, Stoke's Andromeda flight engine for the second stage was shown as it began its journey to the company's test site in Moses Lake, Washington for its own campaign. We'll continue to bring you updates as Nova continues to take shape. And if you want to follow along with this and other news, you know what to do. Like and subscribe to get notified when we post our spaceflight updates so you don't miss out. Chinese launch provider CAS Space launched its new 3-core vehicle for the first time earlier this week. This is the first of several Chinese designs that are set for a maiden launch in the coming weeks. The Lijian 2, or Kinetica 2, first took to the skies on March 30th. Standing 53 meters high, the rocket can fly in a 0, 2, or 4 booster configuration, delivering between 2 and 20 tons to low Earth orbit. A forthcoming Canastra 1 kick stage will later support higher energy missions to geostationary orbits. Those cores have a 3.35 meter diameter that's commonly used on other Chinese rockets and are just a little narrower than those on Falcon Heavy. This week's debut mission flew in an expendable configuration, but CAS Space plans to land all 3 cores as a single unit in the future when it steps into reusability in 2028. Now that is going to be really interesting to see. But this wasn't the only vehicle making its debut on this flight. One of 3 payloads on board was the prototype of the Qiangzhou cargo vehicle. This is one of 2 new craft contracted in 2024 to commercially resupply the Tiangong space station. Qiangzhou is a lightweight and low-cost solution to complement the larger Tianzhou craft currently supplying the station. The ship will carry up to 2 tons of cargo, and the first operational model is expected towards the end of this year when it will dock at the station. For now, the prototype will conduct a series of experiments and tests at different orbital altitudes. 2 other Chinese vehicles have been setting up for their own inaugural flights. Space Pioneer's Tianlong 3 had been expected to launch since the start of the year, and it finally took to the skies on April 3rd, but experienced a problem on the ride up. Space Pioneer has yet to provide further details as we publish this episode, so we may know more next week. At 71 meters tall and 3.8 meters in diameter, the Tianlong 3 is very similar in size as well as design to the Falcon 9. It's somewhat heavier, with a comparable but lower payload to orbit, with familiar-looking grid fins and landing legs. The first stage is powered by 9 Tianhuo 12 engines, which burn the same liquid kerosene and oxygen mix, or Kerolox, as the Lijian 2 and Falcon's Merlin engines. Space Pioneer has recently tested release mechanisms for the deployment of flat-packed satellites, such as Qianfan, which the vehicle is set to carry later. This satellite internet constellation plans to become a Chinese equivalent of Starlink. Finally, Deep Blue Aerospace has been preparing its reusable Xingyun 1, or Nebula 1, for flight. This vehicle uses 9 3D printed engines, which are also fueled by Kerolox, and the first flight hardware has grid fins but no landing legs, so we're expecting its suborbital maiden flight to end with a vertical sea landing. If all goes well, the Oriental Spaceport in Haiyang does have a recovery platform that's now ready to support rocket recoveries at sea when the company is ready to try out a landing. We'll keep a close eye on these new launchers as more new designs take to the sky for the very first time. Impulse Space has shared a slow-motion video of its Deneb engine undergoing testing at Mojave. Deneb is the vacuum-optimized engine for the company's new Helios kick stage, sometimes referred to as a space tug. The 67 kilonewton engine burns liquid methane and oxygen in an oxygen-rich staged combustion cycle and is designed for high-thrust and rapid high-energy missions. These might include transferring up to 5 tons of payload from low Earth orbit to geostationary orbit in less than a day, compared to the months that other transporters using electric propulsion might take. Helios will be used for a variety of high delta-V transfers, including to cislunar and even heliocentric orbits. With Helios able to unlock lunar and other planetary orbits, Impulse Space has ambitions to combine its ride with landers to provide cargo deliveries to the moon, potentially as soon as 2028.
We're willing to do, like, we've got a Mars lander. I'd love to do a lunar lander. I want to go to the outer planets. I love that as soon as we announced, the spec on Helios, that, Scott Manley and others are already looking at this thing. It's how to get interplanetary probes out there. Would love to do things like that.
For now, the Deneb engine is steadily advancing through its campaign, with each run bringing Impulse Space even closer to a flight-ready system. Another spacecraft that's been on the move is Japan's Martian Moons Explorer, or MMX. The craft was designed and constructed by Mitsubishi Electric, the developers of the H-3 rocket, HTV cargo craft, and deep space sample return missions such as Hayabusa 2. MMX was delivered by sea to the Tanegashima Space Center on March 28th, where it has since been moved into the Spacecraft Test and Assembly Building for final system testing. However, this is far more than just another deep space probe. Its mission is designed to answer one of the biggest open questions in planetary science. Where did Mars's 2 small moons, Phobos and Deimos, come from? Were they captured asteroids, or the remnants of a massive impact on Mars itself? To find out, MMX will travel to the Red Planet, where it'll attempt several landings on Phobos to collect samples and send them all the way back to Earth, something that no other mission has ever done before from the Martian system. The mission will span around 6 years and is currently targeting a launch no earlier than this October aboard an H3 launcher, reaching Mars roughly a year later. With around 6 months to go, Japan's next Great Sample Return mission has now entered its final stretch before launch. Now, of course, we've spent most of this episode discussing this week's main event, Artemis II, and even touched on China's Kinetica 2 demo flight, but believe it or not, even more interesting launches happened this week. So, without further ado, this is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. Rocket Lab launched its mission called Daughter of the Stars this week, which was the company's first launch for the European Space Agency. Lifting off from Launch Complex 1A at New Zealand's Mahia Peninsula, Electron carried 2 CubeSats for ESA's Celeste constellation to low Earth orbit. Formerly known as LEO PNT, Celeste is set to demonstrate satellite navigation with low Earth orbit-based satellites, unlike other systems like GPS and Europe's Galileo, which are all stationed in medium Earth orbit. Of course, SpaceX also launched a few times this week, the first of which was for the Transporter 16 rideshare mission from Vandenberg in California. The mission delivered 119 payloads for different providers into sun-synchronous orbit. SpaceX followed this launch with 2 Starlink missions, both flying from Florida's Cape Canaveral, expanding the internet constellation with 58 Starlink V2 mini satellites. The calendar flipped to April this week, so it's time for our monthly statistics. We know you all love them so much. The month of March saw 30 launches worldwide, making it the busiest March ever, bringing the total number of launches this year up to 72. Exactly half of these missions flew on a Falcon 9, and as is tradition, China followed SpaceX with 8 launches this month. Unfortunately, we had one failure, the Kairos launch from Japan's Space 1. Closing out the week, we had even more first flights. Chinese company Space Pioneer launched the maiden flight of its Tianlong 3 rocket, which we discussed earlier in the episode. Now, you might remember this rocket for its accidental liftoff during a static fire test in 2024. This time, however, its flight was intentional, as the rocket ignited its 9 first-stage engines on April 3rd and took to the skies above Zhochuan. Unfortunately, it didn't make it all the way to orbit. And at the end of the week, Russia surprised us by launching a Soyuz from Plesetsk, carrying a Meridian communications satellite for military and civil purposes into a Molniya orbit. Next week promises to be another busy week. ULA plans to launch an Atlas V to lift another batch of Amazon LEO satellites into low Earth orbit. This mission is scheduled for no earlier than April 4th, taking off from Space Launch Complex 41 in Florida. From neighboring Slick 40, SpaceX plans to launch a Cygnus cargo resupply craft to the International Space Station. Falcon 9 is set to lift off with Cygnus in its fairing on April 8th from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The booster will then come home for a return to launch site landing, so prepare for sonic booms if you're in the area. Additionally, we're also expecting SpaceX to launch 2 Starlink missions from Vandenberg. From Europe's spaceport in Kourou, Vega C is set to launch ESA's SMILE spacecraft, which is a collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Sciences to study how solar wind interacts with Earth's magnetic field. China also has a few launches planned for next week, including a Changzheng 8 from the commercial site of Wenchong and a Changzheng 6A from Taiwan. Meanwhile, Russia is also set to launch its brand new Soyuz 5 on a suborbital trajectory, lifting off from Baikonur. As always, the spaceflight schedule could change at any moment, so keep an eye on Next Spaceflight for the latest schedule changes. It's a great way to make sure that you don't miss anything. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.